actually really difficult to move between these worlds, between the world, the so-called normal world where I live in Berlin now, and between the worlds where I work, because the realities are so different. What people are worried about, what are people's concerns, are completely worlds apart. In Fallujah, you don't know just the dangers of this project. Home After War was about the dangers of improvised explosive devices in Iraq and the region. And when we were there, we were following the Iraqi army as they were showing us, what's going on. And they told us to keep really in the path of the vehicles, to not step 1 foot to the right or 1 foot to the left, because a lot of the areas had still not been cleared of these IEDs and bombs. And to go from there, where you don't know if your next step is going to be safe or not, to Berlin is quite, you need a bit of time to kind of get used to life again, the way that you would do in your everyday life. But I think you also need a safe space and a safe area to feel like you're comfortable. I think I feel always more when you see children in areas of war or conflict, and then you come back and you see children in the cities that you live in. I think that's when it hits you the hardest. The realities are very different. Their futures are going to be different. And what are we doing to kind of make sure that their futures can, to bridge the gap between the futures of these children on different parts of the world? It's really hard to find an audience that can, I guess, at FMX, I was really surprised at how interested people still were in a project such as Home After War. That came as a real surprise, because I was sitting in some of the talks and I was also wondering, wow, they're going into so much detail talking about their hair department and the clothes department and how they fix these things. And on the other hand, when you work for social impact using immersive media, you work in very small teams, and very frugally. You have to be really frugal with your money, and it's also sometimes really hard to kind of detach yourself from the obsession of the technology. And as an artist or a storyteller or a journalist, it's my role to use the technology to tell a story. My role is not to sell the technology for the story. So sometimes it's really hard to kind of, at conferences such as this, it's really hard to keep reminding yourself. It's important to keep reminding yourself, like, why are you doing this in the first place? Because it's very, very easy to get hung up on the technical side of things, and it's great to then bring the discussion back to, hey, but why are we doing this in the first place? It might be for social impact, or it might be for entertainment, it might be for telling a story. I definitely feel part of a community of storytellers or journalists who are out there to tell the stories of the people who might not have the resources to get their stories out. It's not my job to tell their stories. These stories are the people's stories, and they have complete ownership of their stories. I think the way that our world is structured is that their stories just don't have as much of a space, or they don't find the space in our mediatized world. And I'm always happy to be part of a community that is working towards bridging also this gap, making voices that are normally unheard heard, and to kind of facilitate this dialogue as well. For instance, in Home After War, which is the story of an Iraqi father who lost 2 sons to an IED or an improvised explosive device. Unfortunately, this is a really classical post-conflict story where families are broken, there's loss and there's tragedy because, after a war, that's what happens. Life doesn't just spring back up. You need some time to rebuild lives. And we are not telling enough of these stories. A lot of the times, the idea is that, oh, once the fighting is over, the war is over, and we are not interested in speaking about this issue anymore. But actually, there is a lot to be spoken about. There's a lot to be documented. There's a lot to be done to bring families back to their livelihoods and life just back to how it was after a war. And it's hard because this is not sexy. That is hard to do as a journalist or a filmmaker or a creator, is to speak about how do you make topics that are not sexy. And that's where I think technology can play a role. If you're able to give people insights in a way that they've never experienced before, such as using photogrammetry to take audiences to places they've never been before and they will never go in their lives, bring them closer, have them have an encounter with someone from somewhere else and in another part of the world. That's going to build a kind of empathy, and at least that's the hope, that that's going to bring people closer together to each other. It's really fascinating to see how people in the VR experience behave in a way that they would behave in everyday life, in normal life outside of the headset. And that is something I find fascinating about the medium of VR itself, is to be able to, it gives you really a view inside people. Because as a creator, you can actually see, because it's such an individual medium that one person goes through this piece at a time inside a headset. And it's quite different as a creator when you create a VR piece and you see the reactions from your audience, because you're actually paying attention to individual reactions. Whereas if you're showing a film in a theater with 500 people, I think the reactions are kind of, they all mash up together and you have this macro kind of view into how people felt. Whereas, if you normally do speak to each user or audience member that has seen your piece, and that's really insightful. And the way someone behaves in the piece is also really really interesting to see. So there's this one part in the experience, Home After War, where our protagonist, Ahmaied, he talks about, it's a very sad moment in the piece, where he talks about the loss of his sons and what it does to him, and how he can't forget them, and how he still picks up his phone sometimes and tries to call them, even though he knows that that phone call is not going to get him anywhere. At that moment, most people in the virtual reality experience move closer to him, as close as possible, in order to be able to comfort him. And there are, of course, people who are, stepping back because they are overwhelmed by the situation. Just this insight into how people behave in a scenario like this is fascinating to see. And most people are really moved, no matter where we've shown the piece, and we've shown it at more than a few dozen venues, and whether it's politicians, whether it is people in no matter what continent we've shown it in, the overwhelming reaction has been that of solidarity. People want to support families such as Ahmaid's. And I think that's really powerful because, right now we are in Europe now, and there is an overwhelming kind of a wave of sentiment where people are saying, oh, why do refugees need to come to Europe? Why can't they just stay where they are? And if you hear a very personal account such as Ahmaid's, it's very hard to make that argument coming out of the headset and saying, him and his family, they should just stay in Iraq. No one's going to say that. Or if you do say that, that's really heartless, And I haven't heard anyone react in that manner. So I think there is what the piece does is it gives you the opportunity to connect with someone in a very intimate way. It's kind of really incredible to see how kind of memory, people don't have a memory of their past sometimes when it's convenient, And that's the war that happened here is very much still, as you say, very much still in our lives. And if a country like Germany, which had so much support after the Second World War to, get back into production, get the infrastructure fixed, countries like Iraq and Syria do not have that. And it's still here, as you're saying, like you still find these bombs and these remnants of, the war after 70 years. So, and that's in Germany. And you can imagine what needs to happen in the region, to be able to be completely safe. That's going to take a long, long time, and it's going to be a lot of effort. For me, it's very, very like basic common knowledge that we need to have, we need to have equality or diversity when it comes to who's working in these spaces, because the perspectives that you bring to the table do really add value. Like the way that I'm going to tell a story as a creator or a storyteller is going to be very different from another perspective. So if you block me out of sharing my perspective, it's basically your loss, because why would you not want to have a different perspective? So I think it's actually doesn't make business sense to not have a diverse enough environment that makes people flourish, because you're just ending up not being good enough because you don't have a diversity in perspectives, and that's just your loss in the end.